In 70 years of measuring how Americans feel about the economy, one number has never gone this low: 47.6. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index just shattered every record in its history. Lower than the 2008 financial crisis, lower than the COVID-19 lockdown, lower than the 1980 recession. Americans have never felt this pessimistic about the economy. Today, we break down what that number means, why it crashed, and what happens when it falls this far. Every time this index has crashed below 55, economic pain followed within months. It just crashed through the floor. So what does the data say happens next? In 1952, a Hungarian-born economist named George Katona had a radical idea. He believed that how people feel about the economy could predict what the economy actually does. Most economists dismissed the notion. They trusted hard numbers, factory output, employment figures. Katona argued they were missing something essential. So he designed a survey. 500 households, interviewed each month, asked 5 simple questions about their finances and whether now is a good time to buy. Just ordinary people describing their economic lives. That survey became the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index. For 7 decades, it has been one of the most watched economic indicators in the world. Central bankers monitor it. Wall Street trades on it. The Federal Reserve references it in policy decisions. The index has a remarkable track record. In 1974, during the Arab oil embargo, sentiment plunged to 57.6. A deep recession followed within months. In 1980, as Paul Volcker's Federal Reserve raised interest rates to crush inflation, sentiment fell to 51.7. The economy contracted sharply and unemployment climbed above 10%. In 1990, as the Gulf War sent oil prices surging, confidence dropped to 63.9. A recession began that November. In 2008, as Lehman Brothers collapsed and the housing market imploded, sentiment dropped to 55.3. The Great Recession was already underway. Even during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, when the entire global economy shut down overnight, sentiment only fell to 71.8. That number is worth remembering. Because even a global pandemic did not make Americans as pessimistic as they are right now. But the pattern is not perfect. In 2011, during the debt ceiling crisis, confidence fell to 55.8. Markets panicked. Headlines predicted catastrophe. No recession followed. That exception matters, and we will come back to it. What the data does show consistently is that every genuine recession since 1974 was preceded by a sentiment collapse. Falling confidence does not guarantee a recession, but recessions do not arrive without it. So, what drove sentiment to 47.6 in April of 2026? Not one shock, but 3, arriving simultaneously. The first is inflation. One-year inflation expectations surged to 4.8% in the same Michigan survey. That is the highest inflation expectation reading in over 4 decades. Tariffs imposed on imported goods are passing through to consumer prices across hundreds of categories, from electronics to groceries to clothing. The Tax Foundation estimates the average American household now faces roughly $1,500 per year in additional costs from tariff increases alone. For a single mother working 2 shifts in Milwaukee, that is the grocery bill she can no longer cover. The second shock is energy. Tensions with Iran and the growing risk of disruption at the Strait of Hormuz have pushed oil prices above $100 per barrel. 20% of the world's oil supply passes through that narrow waterway. Any escalation could send prices significantly higher. Gasoline, heating, shipping, food production, every sector that touches energy is feeling the squeeze. And in a modern economy, energy touches everything. The third shock is the labour market. Corporate debt taken on during the low-rate era of 2020 and 2021 is now coming due at sharply higher rates. Companies that borrowed at 1.5% are refinancing at 5 or 6. The math does not work without cutting costs. That means layoffs, hiring freezes, and reduced investment. A warehouse manager in Phoenix watches her team shrink from 40 to 25 and wonders if she is next. These three forces reinforce each other in a vicious cycle. Higher prices reduce purchasing power. Energy costs amplify inflation further. Job anxiety suppresses demand. And weaker demand threatens more layoffs, which drives anxiety even higher. This kind of triple convergence has not occurred since the 1970s. Back then, oil shocks, rising prices, and economic stagnation produced what economists call stagflation, a toxic blend of rising prices and shrinking growth. It took Paul Volcker's brutal interest rate hikes and nearly a decade of pain to resolve. When consumer confidence collapses, it sets off a measurable chain of events. Consumer spending represents 70% of American gross domestic product. 70%. That means the American economy runs on the willingness of ordinary people to spend money. When those people feel pessimistic, they change behavior. They delay buying a car. They postpone home renovations. They cancel vacations. They save more. And that rational individual caution becomes collective, economic damage. What economists call the paradox of thrift. They cut discretionary spending first, then essentials. A couple in their 60s watches their retirement savings drop and quietly cancels the trip they had planned for 30 years. That pullback ripples outward. Retail revenue falls. Restaurants see fewer customers. Companies report weaker earnings. Stock prices drop, eroding household wealth. Employers respond with layoffs. And those layoffs push confidence even lower, creating a self-reinforcing downward spiral. This is the mechanism that turns fear into reality. When enough people believe the economy will worsen, they act in ways that make it worsen. But remember 2011. Confidence collapsed, and no recession followed. What was different? The labour market held firm. Employment data, industrial production, and real income all continued to grow despite the pessimism. The soft data was screaming danger. The hard data said otherwise. That distinction matters enormously right now, because in April 2026, the gap between soft data and hard data has never been wider. Employment numbers remain relatively stable. Gross domestic product growth, while slowing, is still positive. Yet sentiment has fallen further than at any point in the history of the survey. One of these signals is wrong, and the economy will eventually tell us which one. The deeper insight is not simply whether a recession is approaching. The Consumer Sentiment Index measures something more fundamental. It measures collective psychological state. At 47.6, Americans are expressing a level of anxiety not seen in 70 years of measurement. That anxiety reflects real pressures, rising prices, energy instability, job uncertainty. But it also reflects something harder to quantify, a loss of confidence in the direction of the country. Whether that anxiety becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy depends on what happens in the coming months. If inflation moderates, oil prices stabilize, and the labour market holds, confidence could recover the way it did after 2011. History shows that sentiment can snap back almost as quickly as it falls. But if any one of those three pillars cracks, the feedback loop between fear and economic contraction could accelerate rapidly. And unlike 2011, this time the threats are not political theatre over a debt ceiling vote. They are structural forces, tariffs, energy disruption, and corporate debt stress that do not resolve with a congressional compromise. The hard data and the soft data are telling two very different stories. Within the next 6 months, one of them will break. What happens then will decide whether 47.6 was a warning or a beginning.